outside, I'd like to thank the Kerala ISA for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be a part of the PG training session. Basically, this Viva table in the drugs, we will be a array of drugs which are arranged in a particular pattern on the table on the Viva, and this will be discussed exclusively in one table in one of the Viva stations. And most of the time, you will be asked to pick and speak about a drug. And it's not only about in the next few slides, it's not whatever I'm going to tell, it's not only about preparation for exams, but also at the same time, this is for you to remember a drug lifelong. So if you actually, this is one of the methods which I've been following successfully till date, and I wish this would be helpful for you people also. So whenever we discuss about any drug, basically when we discuss or when we talk about a drug or when we try to read about a drug, there is a particular methodology which we can follow, so that if you follow this particular methodology, there's a very high chance that you can retain most of the things what you are going to study. So the general principles, how to start when you are studying for a drug. So usually you start with the name of the drug, the pharmacological name, the chemical name, and its primary use, and if possible, a brief historical aspect of that particular drug. You can read about that, how the drug evolved, and what are the things, what are the development in that. And next, the chemical name of the drug and its classification, to which group does it belong to. Most of the time, usually if you see the drug table on the tray, it will be arranged as induction agents at one side, then opioids in one side, benzodiazepines and other pre-medicants in one side. So basically you should know what group does it belong to. It belongs to the functional classification as well as the pharmacological classifications, depending upon the chemical molecule that is present in the drug. And next is its availability. So many drugs are available in the form of solutions or as powders, or there are certain special packets or packages available, and there are certain special instructions regarding storage of the particular drug. So all those things you need to see. And once you pick up a vial, if you just go through the contents of the vial, you can see it's not only about the pharmacological drug which is content. There are so many other components in the vial which actually are added to the drug to maintain its stability, to improve its storage, and to prolong its shelf life, and also to maintain the drug in a stable condition to prevent its degradation and others. So it's important to understand that these composition of each and every drug solution, because many of the components have certain side effects, or sometimes they might result in unwanted effects for a particular drug. So this is regarding the composition. And many times certain you need to know about the physical properties of the drug, such as how are they diluted, where are they stored, what is the pH of the particular drug, whether it is alkaline or acidic. Because this is important, because when you're trying to dilute this drug with a solution or with a liquid, with a vehicle, you should know what kind of a vehicle, whether you are supposed to use an acidic vehicle, whether you should use a neutral vehicle, or whatever it is. So that's important. In specifically in case of volatile agents, there are certain set of physical properties which are very, very important for you to understand, because each and every physical property has got something to do with the handling of this particular volatile agent. For example, the molecular weight, next is boiling point, then saturated vapor pressure, blood gas solubility, then what is the pressure at which it is stored, then how is it stored, in what kind of bottles, whether it is plain bottle or amber colored bottle. These are so many other physical properties of the drug which you need to understand and read. Because, for example, the importance of boiling point is that you should know whether the drug exists as a liquid or when it is exposed to room temperature and pressure. So that is what is important. And saturated vapor pressure is very important, because you need to see which kind of vaporizer it can fit into, whether inter-use of vaporizer can be done or not. So these kind of information is you can understand this kind of information, or you can deduce this kind of information if you know certain basic things, such as saturated vapor pressure and blood gas solubility coefficient, etc. And this blood gas solubility coefficient and oil gas partition coefficient are two important things which help us to clinically understand or estimate when the drug starts acting, or how long does the drug take to start acting on the patient. And also the oil gas partition coefficient is a reciprocate of your effect on the brain. Smaller is the oil gas partition coefficient, faster is the drug, more potent is the drug. So this kind of information is obtained when you read these parameters. So therefore every component has got some clinical implication, so you cannot escape or you cannot skip that part. And next is the mechanism of action. Basically you will try to understand which receptors. For example, most of the anesthetics you do act on GABA receptors. In addition to that, some of them do act on NMDA receptors, calcium channels, sodium channels, and non-specific even at the certain specific areas such as chemoreceptor trigger zone, and then certain particular areas. For example, ketamine acts on thalamoneocortical junction. So these are the important. So therefore, it's important to understand the mechanism of action, how it acts. So that it helps you to understand what kind of an antagonist you need to use. Once you are thorough with, once you read about all these things, next is the description. Here I have put pharmacokinetics beforehand because before you understand what the drugs does to your body, you should understand what your body does to the drug. Of course, it can always be interchanged. So whenever you discuss about pharmacokinetics, just imagine, because most of the drugs are either given by inhalation or as IV agents. Most in our anesthesia practice, there is nothing called oral, unless in pre-medication. Whereas proper anesthesia management is basically all about giving the drugs either intravascular or as inhalational, intravenous or inhalational method. So as soon as you give a drug, so you just imagine what happens. The drug gets mixed with the blood, and then it flows to the heart, and from there it gets distributed. It reaches the right ventricle, then goes through the pulmonary circulation, comes to left ventricle. From there it spreads onto all the organs of the body. So depending upon the density of blood flow and other things, they preferentially go and flood the organs which are specifically depending upon the blood flow. For example, vessel rich group, then intermediate blood supply group, and then vessel poor group. So depending upon that, the drug also preferentially goes and binds to those organs first. So therefore this is the process, and finally once it goes there, and then eventually it has to redistribute, come back from there, and go to the areas of metabolism. It gets picked up, the plasma starts getting cleared off by the organs which are starting to clear the drug simultaneously. This doesn't occur after particular time, but it all starts right from the time of drug injection itself. So when you inject, that same drug goes to brain, the same drug goes to liver and starts getting eliminated. So it's like that. So it's all simultaneously happening. So this gradually results in the reduction in the blood level of the particular drug, and then gradually eventually the drug is wheeled out of our body. So this is the entire process in nutshell, what happens to the drug in our body, or what we do to the drug. So during these things, there are certain things what you need to remember. One is the volume of distribution, and once you inject, how far it is distributed, where all is it distributed, and what are the factors which influence the preferential uptake of this particular drug in various organs. Not all organs will have the ability to take the drug at the same level. Some drugs preferentially take more, some take less. This is all depending upon the ability of the drug to get dissolved in that particular tissue. So for that, you should understand what is the lipid solubility, and then when the drug is being carried in the blood, it is not only at the free form, sometimes it also binds to so many proteins in the blood. That is so we need to understand how much of the drug is bound to the albumin, or sometimes alpha-1 acid glycoprotein with respect to certain drugs, and how many is the free form. And then once it gets distributed and bound to the protein, and then it reaches a preferential site of action. So how long does it take from the time of injection to the level of site of action to reach it, for it to reach the site of action and the receptor, and then start its effect, and then you clinically see the effect. This time is known as the lag time, or this is commonly seen with neuromuscular blocking agents and opioid drugs. And when you are injecting, you can also, when you read, you can also think about, once you are injecting, what are the problems. Sometimes the injection site itself, it can result in some pain, rashes, etc. So if you can relate that when you're reading, so you can remember it better. Next, what is the mode of termination of the action? So most of the times the drug effect of the drug is by redistribution from the site of its action, most of the anesthesia drugs. So, and then finally it gets metabolized in the liver, kidney, or other organs, and finally gets eliminated. So once it gets metabolized, so it's important to understand and read about metabolites and their residual action. For example, this is particularly important with respect to opioids and benzodiazepines, because many a times the parent drug, the action of the drug outlives the duration of duration of presence of parent drug in the body. Many a times what happens is, for example, if you take drugs like morphine, the metabolites are almost 60%, 40 to 60% as potent as the parent drug. Therefore, they have long-lasting action, be it analgesia or be it respiratory depression. So therefore, it's important that you read about metabolites and also their residual action and how long these metabolites are staying in the body. And it's important to also understand that which are the organs predominantly it undergoes metabolism. Okay. And then certain half-lives, that is alpha 1, alpha 2, and beta. Alpha 1 represents redistribution, primary redistribution half-life, whereas alpha 2 is steady state redistribution, that is to various other organs, that is muscles, etc. And finally beta is the elimination T half. So it is the half-life which occurs with the metabolism of the drug. And then certain special characteristics with respect to particular special drugs, such as propofol or remifentanil, where context sensitivity half-life. So what do you mean by context sensitivity half-life? It's nothing but the time required for 50 reduction of the plasma concentration by 50% after the cessation of a infusion. So this is called context sensitivity half-life, which can vary depending upon the duration of infusion of a drug. So once you are familiar with the once you read about all these pharmacokinetics, once you know how the drug goes inside and how it gets distributed, then where it binds, and then how it acts, how long it takes for its effect to come, and then once you understand all these things, then we can go about pharmacodynamics. So pharmacodynamics is nothing but what the drug does to our body. So basically, this is about most of the time every drug has got effect on every part of the body, irrespective of multiple systems. But for us, of clinical significance is only certain few areas. For example, CNS. So when you read about effect of a drug on CNS, you can actually break it up or fragment the whole CNS effects into multiple areas. If you see the CNS, you can think about the brain part as alone, the white part, the gray matter, and then the cells, and then the cranial nerves, and then various areas of the brain. For example, it might be the motor cortex or sensory cortex, or it can be areas which is representing the pain or chemoreceptor trigger zone, then medullary floor, where you have all these respiratory centers, cardiac centers, etc. So you can individually, just when you're reading about the drug, you can always think about individual areas, and you just visualize where all the drug is acting. And then once you think about the brain matter per se, then there are other things in the skull, that is the CSF and the blood. So what is the effect of this particular drug on the volume of the blood and also the cerebral blood flow, and then the cerebral metabolic rate and CMRO2, that is metabolic requirement of oxygen. This is important because many of the drugs are going to reduce, because this is important because when you are giving anesthesia, you are actually altering with the physiology, and therefore you should always ensure that you are maintaining adequate level of oxygenation of every tissue, particularly the brain. So therefore, it is important to understand the effect of drug on cerebral metabolism as well as CMRO2, oxygen requirement, and then effect on CSF production and absorption, basically to understand the dynamics of intracranial pressure. And then you can also think about effect of a particular drug on the spinal cord, areas of spinal cord such as the anterior horn, posterior horn, lateral horn, or the tracts, spinothalamic, various tracts. Usually they are almost similar. Generally it's a depression. And effect of these drugs on the peripheral nerves, basically on their conduction, whether because if you understand these things, you will be able to interpret the various monitoring tools such as somatosensory evok potential, motor evok potential, visual evok potential, auditory evok potential, etc. in a better ways, because all these things will have some amount of influence on uh, the readings of these various monitoring systems. So in order to interpret them properly, it's very important that you understand the effect of these drugs on these particular nerve conduction, so that you can interpret these results properly. And finally, the effect of these drugs on the neuromuscular plate. You know that volatile agents can directly affect the neuromuscular plate and can potentiate the effect of neuromuscular agents. So therefore, if you read this way, you can remember most of the drugs in much holistic way, and you will be able to apply it clinically also very well. Now coming to the other important organ, that is our cardiovascular system. So most of the time it's of importance to induction agents, opioids, benzodiazepines, and also many of our emergency drugs. For example, your vasoactive agents, inotropic agents, and then vasopressors, etc. Almost all the drugs, whatever we arrange on your anesthesia table in your day-to-day practice, have got some effect on CVS and your cardiovascular system. So basically, when you read regarding a particular drug on cardiovascular system, you see the effect of drug on cardiac contractility, the conduction system, and then the presence of if its effect on ectopic pacemakers. So these are the other and presence of accessory tracts, whether it will influence. For example, propofol is known to potentiate the conduction across the accessory AV tract. That's why it is usually relatively contraindicated in certain types of WPW syndrome. So therefore, these are very, so if you remember that way, if you when you think about, when you read about, for example, propofol, you just think about what's its effect on myocardium, whether it causes myocardial depression or not. Yes. If it yes, yes. If it is no, no. So that way, if you can go and put on plus or minus for everything, you will remember the drug better. Then you think about its effect on larger blood vessels and smaller blood vessels, and then its effect on the drugs, the vascular response to sympathetic and parasympathetic outflow. Many times it might be blunted. It can blunt the effect of receptors. So that's why it's important. For example, we know that propofol has got resetting of these baroreceptors, resulting in lack of compensatory tachycardia to fall in blood pressure. So this way you can remember it in a better sense. Then finally, you should also think about, if you're thinking in terms of vasoactive agents, receptor basis of clinical effects. For example, if you are using dopamine or dobutamine, which all receptors it will act, what is the effect of this, what is the affinity of this particular drug for various receptors. So that will help you to understand. For example, if you see, understand the pharmacology better, understand the usage of drug better. For example, if I quote an example, mephentermine versus noradrenaline. Mephentermine is a indirectly acting beta-1 receptor agonist. So therefore, when you give mephentermine, actually the increase in blood pressure is basically due to increase in cardiac contractility rather than its effect on vascular. So for example, if you are coming across a patient in whom the problem lies with the vasculature, that is the problem of hypertension is due to potent vasodilatation, giving mephentermine, giving noradrenaline, which is a direct alpha agonist and which is expected to act directly on the vessel receptors, is more useful than using mephentermine, which has got more cardiac effect. So that way you can actually clinically apply these knowledge in a better way. So that's the reason why you should understand the receptor basis of each drug, so that you can apply it clinically properly. And also we think about arrhythmogenicity of each drug, whether they are capable of inducing arrhythmias or whether they are capable of suppressing arrhythmias. So that's how you have to read. Now coming to the respiratory system. So when you think about respiratory system, any drug, you start from the head to toe. So you see the effect of drug on central respiratory drive and the peripheral drive, that is effect of respiration on in response to changes in PaO2, PCO2 through central baroreceptors and chemoreceptors. So that is the thing. And then effect of this particular drug on the upper airway with regards to airway reflexes, and then the bronchial tree, whether it is known to cause bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction, and then finally its effect on alveoli. So basically, alveoli means it indirectly is represented in the form of volumes, compliance, and other things. So basically, there is a reduction in functional residual volume, functional residual capacity, etc., or tidal volume reduction and compliance due to the relaxation of muscles, etc. And also its effect on rate, whether it increases the respiratory rate or decreases the respiratory rate, so on so, or whether it preserves the respiratory rate. So that's how we can read. And then next, once you read the alveoli, next is the pulmonary capillaries, whether it has got any effect on pulmonary blood flow, whether it causes pulmonary vasodilatation or constriction, or whether it affects the hypoxic vasoconstriction, vasodilatation, etc. And then finally, the musculoskeletal system of the respiratory uh, tract, that is the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles and the ribs. So most of the time you read about the effect of these drugs on the diaphragmatic contraction, the intercostal muscle contraction. If you actually systematically read it this way, you will be able to remember the drug better. Then finally, these are main systems which we are involved. Of course, you should also think about other systems such as gastrointestinal, renal, and endocrine systems, and splanchnic system, which is very, very important. Hepatic and renal blood flow. Effect of the drug on splanchnic circulation, hepatic circulation, and again, particularly in hepatic, is about its the effect of a drug on arteriovenous buffer system, which is very, very important to ensure adequate hepatic blood flow and hepatic oxygenation. It's not only important about keeping in mind the hepatic ischemia, it's also regarding the metabolism of various drugs. Any drug which reduces hepatic blood flow has got a differential effect of differential effect on metabolism of drugs in the liver. For example, some of the drugs which has got a very high hepatic extraction ratio, that is, once the blood flows to the liver, majority of the drug is taken up because the liver has got a very high capacity to metabolize those drugs. For example, lignocaine, ketamine. So such drugs are significantly dependent upon the hepatic blood flow. Any decreases in hepatic blood flow will result in decrease in metabolism of these drugs. So that is the reason why you should understand the effect of these drugs on hepatic blood flow and renal blood flow. And then gut motility, because PONV, constipation, etc., are all part of your perioperative management. So you should understand the effect of these drugs on these various parameters of this particular system. Then next is endocrine system. Of course, we have with regards to adrenocortical suppression or sympathetic stimulation, sympathetic repression, etc. Next is dose. And once you are reading about all this, once you have read about the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, then next is what is a normal dose of a particular drug, and each dose for each route of administration. Because, for example, there are various drugs which can be used by single route, but there are many drugs which in our anesthesia armamentarium which can be used by multiple routes. For example, if you think of ketamine as an induction agent, it can be used for it can be used as intravenous, intramuscular, intranasal, then perrectal, then intrathecal, epidural, block. So it can be used in various reasons, by various routes, and even sublingual. You can use by various routes. So every route has got its own dosage. So you should be aware of all the particular dosage, and also many times novel routes also can be tried. For example, iontophoretic application, percutaneous patch, transcutaneous patches. So in that case, you should know the drug dosage through each of these routes. Not only that, many drugs can be used at different dosages for different purposes. For example, the dose required for anesthesia is slightly higher, whereas the dose required for monitored sedation is slightly lower, and continuous sedation is further lower. So that way, you should know the dosages for each particular thing. Then next is uses, how the drugs are used, whether what are it's routinely used for, what is it used for, whether there is any novel use. For example, many times now you are using thiopentone. Thiopentone is routinely used for induction of anesthesia, but many times it's also used for WADA test, or it is used for your what do you say, sleep. You make the in crime scene and all. So that way, there has got some novel uses for like that. For example, ketamine nowadays is being used to treat depression. So that way, they have got their own different uses. So you should be aware of those things also. And finally, the drug specific effects such as characteristics or interactions among drugs. It might be physical interactions or it can be pharmacological interactions. Physical interactions which result in precipitation of drug. For example, you cannot mix thiopentone and succinylcholine in the same syringe because it gets precipitated. Likewise, any drug which is taken in a syringe which is preloaded with the dexamethasone, if you use the same syringe, then there is a precipitation. So any mixation, basically mixing of alkaline and acidic drug results in precipitation. Whenever you take sodium bicarbonate with any of your local anesthetics, unless you don't use it in a prescribed dosage, there is always a possibility of precipitation. So that way, you should understand, you should read about those interactions. And finally, the adverse effects, side effects, and contraindications. So what are the specific contraindications? What are the relative contraindications? And adverse effects and side effects, you can actually read while injecting, and then what are the once you inject, what are the side effects and post-operative side effects. That way you can classify and read it so that you can retain it better. With this background, I will just touch upon a few drugs just to quickly go through, so that I am doing it as a compare and contrast so that it's easy, you can follow it up easily. For example, now let us start with thiopentone. So if you go through the same style, okay, the physical properties, it's basically a barbiturate chemically, and it has got a thio ring, which actually adds to the hypnotic property of the drug and also makes it more soluble. And then it's available. Now we are discussing about availability. It is available as 500 mg and 1 gram powder vial, and basically it has a pale yellow powder with bitter taste and sulfur smell, and it is usually mixed with 6% sodium bicarbonate to keep it stable, because it can react with atmospheric carbon dioxide. And also the vial is filled with nitrogen to prevent its to make it keep it stable, and also to prevent its solidification and degradation. And once the solution is prepared, it can be mixed with normal saline or ringer lactate, normal saline or distilled water. You should not dilute it with ringer lactate because it will precipitate. And once the solution, pH of the solution once it's prepared is 10.6, and this solution is prepared to maintain a constitution of 2.5% solution. You cannot use more than that, or you cannot use less than that, because it has got its own problems. If you use more than 2.5%, there is always a possibility of increased incidence of venous thrombophlebitis. Hello. Okay. Sorry. Thrombophlebitis, or it can, if you use less than 2.5%, it can result in hemolysis. And the solution when prepared is stable for 24 hours at room temperature, and it is refrigerated. You can be kept for 1 week. So whereas propofol, on the contrary, it is alkyl phenol, and chemical it is 2,6-diisopropofol, and it's available as 1% solution at various 10, 20, and 50 ml emulsions, and it contains glycerol, eglecithin, and EDTA in certain groups, basically as a preservative. Glycerol is the component. You should understand why glycerol is added, why eglecithin is added. Basically to make it, because it's not water soluble, to make it lipid soluble, you add glycerol, and eglecithin is to keep the drug stable, to prevent its degradation. It can be usually stored in room temperature without much of a problem, but once the vial is opened, it should not be kept for more than 24 hours, because it has got all these ingredients which can favor bacterial growth. Newer preparations are available, that is the prodrug of propofol, that is fospropofol, and other medium chain triglyceride medium triglyceride chain and light chain triglyceride preparations, basically to reduce the pain on injection. These are the newer preparations. So, and then finally, it has to be diluted using 5% dextrose only. So we had finished the physical properties, then mechanism of action, pharmacokinetics. I'll not go through very detail, but only thing what I need to highlight here is there is a hepatic extraction ratio of 0.15. What does this mean? This means that the drug is metabolized very slowly. Thiopentone is metabolized very slowly. Therefore, that if you see the T half beta is 11.6 hours. That means beta T half is elimination T half. So this T half is so long that if you give this drug as a continuous infusion, it takes a very long time. The drugs get saturated in the body after a period of after a certain period of infusion, and eventually the recovery from the drug effect will take a very, very longer time. So that's why you should be very careful while giving thiopental as its infusion, especially when you are using it as an antiepileptic infusion. Okay, and then what does T of alpha mean? That is the time of termination of its effect. So when you give the drug, it gets, because of brain comes under vessel rich group, it gets preferentially distributed to brain, and it starts acting and inducing the patient. And once it gets redistributed to muscle fibers and muscles and other organs, there is termination of its action and the patient recovers. It doesn't mean that the drug is totally out of body. It's just that the drug concentration the blood is not is sufficient enough to produce sedation. So that is the thing. So finally, it is metabolized to pentobarbital and finally to urea. This pentobarbital also has got some sedative effect. So therefore, if you give prolonged infusion, it can also cause sedation. So coming to propofol, again, it's BABA facilitatory action, and pharmacokinetics, basically it is again, once you give IV through IV, it rapidly equilibrate with the brain and cause induction of anesthesia. And compared to thiopental, it has got a greater volume of distribution. That means your dosage has to be slightly higher, especially if the patient has got higher body water. And its elimination T half is 4 to 23 hours, which is slightly lesser when compared to thiopental. This 23 hours is basically in those patients in whom following a prolonged infusion. So, and then clearance is much higher. If you see the clearance, it is 20 ml per minute, whereas clearance from the plasma is 1.5 to 2 liters per minute. So it has got a faster recovery when compared to thiopental. And again, it has got both hepatic and extra hepatic clearance, and contact sensitivity half-life is 8 hours depending upon the following 24 hours infusion. And it is metabolized by basically glucuronide conjugation reaction. So what does this mean? This means that usually in any hepatic derangement, usually the phase 1 reaction is the first to be affected, and phase 2 is the last to be affected. So therefore, thiopental, which is metabolized by phase 1 reaction, will have delayed clearance, whereas propofol, in spite of in the early stages of liver disease, still it has got some amount of faster clearance in spite of liver being damaged. And in addition to that, it has got extra hepatic clearance also, which so therefore the drug has got better clearance from the body when compared to thiopental. So it is more suitable in liver failure patients. So coming to the effects, of course, as I was discussing about the CNS, if you notice, it has got something called Robin Hood phenomenon. This is one thing examiner's favorite question. What do you mean by Robin Hood phenomenon? What does it mean? Is that there is a reduction in cerebral blood flow as well as CMRO2, but the CMRO2 is reduced to a greater extent than the cerebral blood flow. So therefore, there is a margin of safety. In addition to that, because whenever there is a head injury or anything, you know that area there is local vasodilatation to ensure greater oxygen supply to that damaged area. So whenever there is CMRO2, whenever there is cerebral vasoconstriction, these vessels are spared. So therefore, the blood will move from normal area to the damaged area, so that there is preferential movement of blood due to cerebral vasoconstriction from normal area to the injured area, thereby improving the blood supply to the injured area. So this is known as Robin Hood. Robin Hood, basically what he used to do, he used to take from the rich and give it to the poor. Exactly, the thiopental is also doing the same. And one more important thing is hyperanalgesia or antanalgesia with respect to CNS, and it has got one more important effect, that is it can suppress the electroencephalographic activity better than any other drug. So therefore, it has got a potent anti-epileptic effect. So again, cardiovascular, I told, I have mentioned tachycardia, hypotension, basically due to vasodilatation, and it also has got some degree of myocardial depression. There is something called Pearl Harbor tragedy, which is very common among certain examiners. Basically, this happened during the Second World War, when there was inadequate understanding or inadequate understanding of how the thiopental would act. So what happened was, every wounded soldier used to be given thiopental for induction of anesthesia when he underwent some surgical procedure. This resulted in immediate death of the patient because the patient was already hypovolemic, and this Thiopentone caused severe vasodilation and myocardial depression, which resulted in cessation of perfusion to the vital organs, resulting in instant cardiac arrest. So this was understood over a period of time, and that's why this famous terminology term, that is Pearl Harbor tragedy. So coming to propofol, almost it's as good as thiopentone in all other aspects, except for the fact that it has got a more potent decrease in systemic vascular resistance when compared to thiopentone. It also has got some degree of myocardial depression. And main important thing is it causes minimal change in heart rate following hypotension, unlike thiopentone, which causes tachycardia. This is mainly due to its effect on the baroreceptors, central baroreceptors, which results in which is suppression of baroreceptors results in absence of tachycardia to hypotension. And it has also got preservation of myocardial oxygen demand supply ratio because it prevents tachycardia. So therefore, it has got some cardioprotective effect. So coming to respiratory system of thiopentone, effect of thiopentone on respiratory system, basically it induces bronchospasm at lighter planes because it doesn't suppress the airway reflexes. Then whereas propofol can it depresses the airway reflexes, therefore it favors airway instrumentation without muscle relaxation also. An important thing is that propofol causes apnea, which is not often seen with thiopentone. So that is one thing. And then there are few interesting questions by regarding thiopentone by the examiners during Viva. One is what is mean by Verrill sign, and what do you mean by sleep dose and induction dose of thiopentone? Okay, so these were some of the questions which were asked in my previous classes. So Verrill sign is nothing but when you start giving thiopentone and observe loss of eyelash reflex, there is a drooping of eyelids. When the eyes are when the patient has got eyes wide open, once you start giving thiopentone, once the patient, as he gets induced, there is a there is dropping of eyelids. This is known as Verrill sign. And whereas once you sleep dose, and this one is you give half the dose of thiopentone and see if the patient goes into sleep, and then gradually go on giving the dose till there is loss of eyelash reflex. You don't give entire full loading dose or full loading dose. So this is known as a sleep dose and hypnotic dose of thiopentone. This is some of the important questions. And then thiopentone with regards to propofol, again, so interesting thing is that it has got a powerful anti-emetic effect and also antipruritic effect. So coming to the usages and dosages, of course, porphyria is one of the absolute contraindication for thiopentone. Propofol, there are nothing, but important thing with regards to propofol, what you need to read about is propofol infusion syndrome and green urine, passage of green urine following propofol infusion. These two things you need to read. So now moving on to induction agents like maintenance, that is IV agent, I mean inhalation agents. I'll be discussing about briefly rushing through isoflurane and sevoflurane. Basically, as I told, you should know that it's a clear flammable liquid which is stored in amber, and you will in addition to this you should also remember that this drug is stored in amber colored bottles, and also the color coding, because nowadays we have agent specific vaporizers, and the vaporizing systems, vapor filling systems are basically color coded and touch coded. So for that you should know the color coding and touch coding of various vaporizers, various inhalation agents. So MAC, I told you MAC, blood gas partition coefficient, boiling point, saturated vapor pressure. It's important to note that the saturation vapor pressure is 238, which is almost similar to that of halothane, which is 243. So therefore, halothane and isoflurane vaporizers sometimes can be reused. Okay. Then coming to the metabolism, it's only 0.2% is metabolized in liver. Hello, I'm in class. I'm presenting. Huh? I'm presenting. I'm calling. Coming to the systemic effects, we all know that important thing is it causes cerebral vasodilatation, reverse Robin Hood phenomenon, and also main thing is the cerebral vasodilatation among the various inhalation agents. This causes least cerebral vasodilatation when it is used at 1 Mach, and at 1.6 Mach the cerebral blood flow doubles, and that is what is important. So therefore you have that margin, greater margin. So among the various agents, this is much better, much safer. For among halothane and isoflurane, this is safer. So likewise, with respect to myocardial, we all know about coronary steal syndrome, where there is redistribution. This is mainly because of relaxation of the resistance vessels or the arterioles rather than the major arteries, which results in distribution of blood to the normal areas from the ischemic area. So of course, this is only a theoretical concern. Clinically, it is found to have myocardial protection to reperfusion injury, and it is known to protect myocardium from many times ischemic episodes due to its potential beneficial effects. It causes myocardial depression and decreases systemic vascular resistance. And with regards to airway, it has got a bronchodilatory effect. Direct effect is it causes, of course, when we come from the top to bottom, yeah, you can think in terms of CNS depression. It causes depresses the respiratory center, reduces the rate. Then there is a shallow rapid breathing as we go through the depth of anesthesia, and then there is the decrease in the volumes, and also there is relaxation of the both the skeletal muscles as well as the diaphragmatic muscles. It also causes suppresses the airway reflexes, but it also induces secretions. So compared to halothane, which is because of its pungent smell, whereas halothane has got a sweet smell. So, and sevoflurane also has got a sweet smell. So because of this, it is known to be beneficial. It is less beneficial when compared to halothane and sevoflurane for inhalation induction. Then it also causes relaxation of the uterine muscle like any other volatile agents. And it potentiates the effect of neuromuscular blocking agents. When compared to all other drugs, it has got the maximum effect. And also not to forget its ability to stimulate malignant hyperthermia. And with respect to liver, it has got a preservation of arteriovenous buffer system, as I discussed earlier. So this is one of the prominent effects of isoflurane when compared to other volatile agents. So coming to its uses, of course, it's used only as a maintenance agent, and contraindications. Generally, it is contraindicated in malignant hyperthermia and in patients in whom there is severe myocardial depression. Coming to sevoflurane, anyway, saturated vapor pressure is much lower, and MAC is 2%. Blood gas, it has got a very low blood gas solubility coefficient when compared to others. So therefore, it has got faster induction and faster recovery. So it causes dose dependent increase in cerebral blood pressure. It causes decrease in CMRO2, dose dependent fall in blood pressure, coronary vasodilatation, and it also causes bronchodilation. The rest of the things are almost. What is important with regards to sevoflurane is to formation of compound A, which is due to its reaction with the soda lime. And there is something called rule of two, commonly asked in the exam. This is with regards to its usage. Whenever this compound A formation is exaggerated when you use for more than 2 hours, and when the inspired concentration is more than 2%, and also when the fresh gas flow is less than 2 liters per minute. And this compound A is known to cause nephrotoxicity. So basically affecting the renal tubules. So coming to opioids, again, we discuss, I'm comparing and contrast between morphine and fentanyl. Morphine is a natural opioid. Fentanyl is synthetic piperidine. And morphine is available with preservative and without preservative, and both of them act on all the opioid receptors. And what is important here is, if you see, protein bound concentration of morphine is only 20 to 40%, whereas fentanyl is 84% bound to plasma protein, and this is bound to alpha-1 acid glycoprotein. And unlike morphine is bound to albumin, whereas fentanyl is bound to alpha-1 acid glycoprotein. And all of them have got fentanyl is more widely distributed and has got faster elimination, T half, when compared to morphine. So main thing is hepatic extraction ratio. If you see, as I discussed earlier, it's 0.6 to 0.8 and 0.8 to 1. That means any decrease in hepatic blood flow is going to affect the metabolism of these two drugs. So coming to the metabolites, morphine 3 glucuronate and morphine 6 glucuronate are the metabolites of these drugs. And morphine 6 glucuronate is found to have around 60 to 70% of analgesic effect of morphine, whereas morphine 3 glucuronate is known to cause CNS stimulation. And these two are excreted by urine. So therefore, renal failure will cause accumulation of these metabolites and can result in problems. Whereas fentanyl metabolized as norfentanyl, this undergoes phase 1 metabolism, that is norfentanyl, and only a small percent gets glucuronate conjugation. And these metabolites have got around 30 to 40% effect, and they are usually cleared faster. So coming to the effects, almost one thing, the main thing that differentiates morphine and fentanyl is the respiratory depression. Respiratory depression most often with morphine. Both of them are reversible by naloxone, but morphine can induce early and rate respiratory depression due to the metabolites as well as its direct, and it's more so with intrathecal morphine, where initial respiratory depression is due to the drug, whereas a late respiratory depression is due to the ascent of the intrathecal drug to the its direct effect, intrathecal administration of morphine. The morphine directly acts on the respiratory center on the medulla due to migration of the drug in CSF. So, and fentanyl is known to cause wooden chest. That is one important thing. And morphine is known to cause histamine release, and it has got its own effect. Histamine release can cause vasodilatation and tachycardia, vasodilatation and bronchospasm. So both the drugs can cause biliary spasm, gastroparesis, etc. And it's also known to cause urinary retention. And both the drugs is known to have immunosuppression, and susceptibility to infection. And both morphine and fentanyl are being used by various routes, that is intravenous, intramuscular, then intrathecal, epidural, and to blocks also. So the dose of morphine, so one thing what you need to understand is the morphine is hydrophilic, whereas fentanyl is lipophilic. So the drug dosage intrathecal versus IV is similar in case of fentanyl, whereas in case of morphine, the IV dose, the intrathecal or epidural dose is 1/10 or 1/20th of IV dose. This is because the drug is not lipophilic, so it will stay in the CSF or it will stay in the epidural space for a longer time until unless it is cleared. So therefore, you have to use a smaller dose of morphine epidurally or intravenously, or intrathecally when compared to IV dose. So muscle relaxants, I'm comparing vecuronium and atracurium. One is steroidal and the other one is benzoisoquinone groups. And almost the steering thing is atracurium undergoes metabolism by Hoffman elimination. That is one thing. What is interesting here is atracurium and cisatracurium have got different percentage of different elimination. That is Hoffman elimination varies. Hoffman elimination percentage is only 40% with atracurium, whereas cisatracurium it is more than 60%. So therefore, it has got more propensity for spontaneous recovery. Okay, so that's the thing. And here the metabolite is ladenosine, which can be CNS stimulant. Whereas in case of vecuronium, the metabolism 3-hydroxyvecuronium, which undergoes phase 1 metabolism, 3-hydroxyvecuronium is excreted through kidney, and therefore in case of renal failure and liver failure, the drug can accumulate and can result in prolonged effect. So therefore, this metabolite is also active. So therefore, it can prolong the effect of drug. So the pharmacodynamics, here one of the common questions asked is, what do you mean by ED50 and ED95? ED50 is nothing but a reduction in 50% of the height of a single twitch following the drug administration. Once you give the drug and then after some time you test for the muscle contraction by single twitch method, 50% reduction in the twitch suppression is ED50, and 95% reduction in the single twitch response is ED95. So this is basically required to quantify the effect of the drug, and intubation dose is 2 to 3 times the ED95, and maintenance is almost half of almost 75% of the ED95. So that's the reason why you know these values, and then its effect on various systems. Here basically there are only three systems. One is neuromuscular junction and the um, autonomic nervous system. Generally they are inert with respect to autonomic nervous system because nicotinic receptors are there, so you're bothered about autonomic nervous system. The earlier muscle relaxants had some effect on autonomic nervous system, sympathetic ganglia like galamine and DTC, all those things had effect on autonomic ganglia, whereas newer these muscle relaxants don't have. So these are the various dosages and indications and contraindications. And not touched upon other drugs like benzodiazepines and local anesthetics per se. Lignocaine is commonly is asked, so you should know about the metabolites of lignocaine, the tachyphylaxis with regards to lignocaine, and these are some of the questions that are commonly asked. Because of time constraints, I have restricted only to this much. Thank you.